We're delighted today to have an opportunity to speak with Dr. Brian Iwata from the University of Florida about his years as a behavior analyst, his history in behavior analysis, and where he sees the field going in the future. We'll get right started. Brian, what events in your own history led you to be a behavior analyst?
Well, I attended a small liberal arts college as an undergraduate, so I did not know much about different areas in psychology other than, let's say, clinical, experimental, industrial, and so forth. And so when I applied to graduate school, I applied to a number of different ones in no particular area. And I got a fellowship to Florida State University. And it just so happened that my advisor, the advisor who was assigned to me during my first year, was John Bailey, who had just gotten his degree from the University of Kansas. And I knew very little about behavior analysis when I entered the program, but very quickly he started this little shaping procedure on me. And although I was a fellow, or because I was a fellow, I didn't really have any other responsibilities. But he said, well, you know, I'm a struggling first-year faculty member, and I've got to teach these courses. Would you be willing to help me with one of my undergraduate classes? So I said, sure, that'd be fine. So he started me out grading tests for one of his courses. It was child development. And it just so happened that he used the Bijou and Bear text and also Java articles. So, of course, in order to grade the quizzes, I had to read the material. And during the course of that term, I got my first exposure to behavior analysis. And then, of course, he asked me if I'd be willing to give a lecture in the class and so forth. And so by the end of the term, I was pretty much a convert. He also didn't have any lab set up at that time. So he suggested that I might want to volunteer to help some of the more senior graduate students who were doing work in various settings. So I hooked up with two grad students, Rod Hammond and Rick Zadargas. And they were doing work in the public schools and were conducting classroom management studies. And so I got introduced to becoming an observer in their studies, and then designing data sheets, and then training other observers, and so forth. So that's the way it all began.
Can you expand a little on your training as a behavior analyst per se?
Oh, well, you know, Florida State was an interesting program. It didn't have a behavior analysis specialty per se, but there were behaviorally trained faculty in several of the different areas. So, for example, the courses that I took in the area of applied behavior analysis, those were taught by John. There was a clinical faculty member there. Actually, there were two. But the one who taught me the clinical courses was Dick Hagan. And he was a behaviorally trained clinician out of the University of Illinois who did his work with, I think, Gordon Paul. Then there was another behavioral analysis faculty in the area of school psych, Charlie Madsen, who also did his graduate training out at Illinois with Wes Becker and Dan O'Leary. And then I took basic courses from several operant conditioners. One of them was Mike Rashad, who was an operant conditioner trained up in Toronto, and his interest area was appetite. And then there were the Cohens, Perrin and Leela Cohen, who did both classical and operant conditioning research, and they were trained at Columbia. They were students of Nat Schoenfeld's. So although John Bailey really was the lone ranger in applied behavior analysis, there were a number of other faculty who specialized in various areas related to operant conditioning. And so I took classes from all of them.
Can you speak a little bit about how your career developed as you moved on, as you graduated from FSU and went forward in your early career?
Well, I was a clinical major, and so I had to do an internship. And usually that involved moving to some other location for a year at one of these APA-approved internship sites. But it just so happened that there was a hospital in town. It was a hospital for handicapped children. And they were attempting to develop some behavioral programs for these handicapped children. And so they came to me and said, if you'd be willing to help do that, then we will count that as your internship, and you wouldn't have to leave town, and you can continue your research, and so on and so forth. So it seemed like a really nice deal to me. And the stumbling block, though, was that I had no experience whatsoever in developmental disabilities, none whatsoever. But that exposure opened my world to this entire population that clearly need a lot of help. And it just seemed that applications of operant conditioning were the solution to many of their problems. So probably in my last years in graduate school, I developed an interest in the area of developmental disabilities. When I went to Western Michigan, there were several possibilities in the department to collaborate with ongoing programs in the community. And so my students and I began working with clients who had developmental disabilities. And our early focus was on teaching them community skills so that they could leave the institution and enter community-based living facilities. And we had a whole line of research on community survival skills, so to speak, for kids with various handicapping conditions. But as we began to do more of that work, we encountered a group of people who were living in these institutions, and it was very clear they weren't going to go anywhere at all, anytime soon. These were the people who engaged in self-injurious behavior, aggressive behavior, and so forth. And over the years, over the course of my time at Western, our interest changed from working with the individuals who were on their way out to the individuals who had more intractable behavior problems. Because the technology of community living was a relatively easy technology to develop. People respond well to instructions, they generalize easy, and so forth. But the individuals who had extreme behavior problems, they were the more difficult ones. And so that's how my interest in behavior disorders began. When I then moved to Baltimore, the setting was a hospital setting. And there we clearly saw the children who had the most severe problem behaviors, and so that's where the interest continued.
And that was the time when you developed the functional analysis approach to assessing and treating self-injurious behavior. And can you tell us a little bit about some of the antecedents that set the occasion for your development of that particular approach to dealing with this issue?
Well, that could be a long story. Let me give you the short version. We were developing a short-term hospitalization program for children with severe self-injurious behavior. And we were limited in terms of our length of stay to about 16 to 20 weeks, which meant that they appear on our doorstep on day one, and we have 16 to 20 weeks to eliminate the self-injurious behavior, to replace it with some substitute behaviors, to put together a maintenance and generalization program, and they're gone. And the philosophy at the time was to use what was known as the least intrusive approach to intervention, which typically meant that all the treatment protocols were organized according to intrusiveness, and you started up at the top and you just kept on going further and further down, and hopefully you would see some success before you got to the big line. We sometimes didn't produce a successful outcome. We just ran out of time. And so we began looking for different ways to make decisions about how to implement interventions. And from my clinical background, I had developed an interest in assessment. And given that the interventions we were using involved rearrangement of contingencies, then somewhere along the line, it struck us that what we should be doing before we selected a contingency was to see which ones seemed to be most relevant to the occurrence of their problem behavior. And so we began looking at the background research on origins of problem behavior and developed a series of conditions that mimic those in a natural environment that would bring out, so to speak, behavior that was maintained by certain consequences.
That was a point in the development of our whole discipline, in which there was no board certification. There weren't any positions out there for behavior analysts per se. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to be a behavior analyst during that period?
With the grad school period or the post-grad school period?
Previous to a point where the discipline became sufficiently established and professionalized in the sense that it is today.
Well, let me go to back to my grad school days, because I think that's where the most exciting things were occurring, at least from my view. This was probably the early 1970s. And at that time, Java had been well established for several years. And so the development of the field pretty much unfolded on the pages of Java. And at that time, much of the research was being done in classrooms because that afforded investigators access to large populations of subjects with people who had developmental disabilities and with individuals who were part of the, quotes, mental health system, people who were patients at psychiatric hospitals. So those fields were fairly well established when I began graduate school. What was exciting was to see new developments. And the ones that come to mind that were particularly interesting were things such as the movement related to environment, ecology, and behavior. So that there was a long string of studies that began in the 1970s on things such as how do we reduce littering in campgrounds, how do we get people to recycle, to decrease the amount of electricity that they used in their houses. And I thought all of that was just such a terrific application of behavioral principles because it had such a widespread effect if that technology was ever adopted. Another one was the emergence of behavioral medicine. The relation between health and behavior had been known for a long time, but what to do about that relation was not well known. And it turns out that, of course, many of the chronic diseases are a function of the behaviors that we exhibit. And so changing behavioral lifestyles would have a terrific impact on the long-term health consequences. In addition to that, people who are hospitalized for one reason or another often acquire a variety of behavior problems. They stop eating, they don't follow their medical regimens, and so a lot of that research was beginning to be done at that time, and all those applications, again, had the potential for such widespread usage that they would really need to see unfold. And I guess if I were to pick a third area, I would say gerontology. Which still, as far as I'm concerned, has not come into its own. Most of the work being done at that time and today focuses on people who are developing and for who, for one reason or not, are not developing. But another whole side of the picture is people who are losing skills for one reason or another, and whether we can actually rearrange their environments to reduce the rate at which they lose those skills. And so what was really exciting to me back in those days was to see all these areas popping up one by one because they opened up entire new areas of research and application.
Yeah. You speak of some of the exciting developments in our field over the years, and for many of us, you've been responsible for several of those. I wonder what you would consider to be your most important contributions to the field, and what would you like to be remembered for?
I think that, well, in my own view, if I am to have a sort of greatest contribution, it would be in terms of preparing students. My group is known mostly for its empirical work, but almost all that empirical work has been done by my students. And so if I've made any lasting contribution, I think it will have been to train graduate students to go on and to make other contributions, both of an empirical nature and in terms of training more students.
You mentioned, again, a few developments in the field, some of which continued to flourish, some of which, such as some of the large community applications, may not have developed as some of us would have liked to have seen. How do you think behavior analysis has changed over the course of your career?
So you're talking about just general changes in the field rather than reasons why some of these areas flourished or didn't flourish.
Let's talk about some of the reasons why some of these areas flourished or didn't.
Well, of course, it's all speculative, right? Because I actually don't know what is responsible for anything. But let's just maybe take a couple of examples. And one will be one that I already mentioned: environment and behavior, the ecological movement. There's clearly a lot that we can do in terms of preserving the environment and reducing waste, but it seems like a much larger impact has been made in terms of legislation and engineering, so that if we can get a lot of people to do things simply by requiring them to do them, that is to recycle, all right, and come up with cheaper ways of producing energy, then the fact that a lot of people are wasteful, although that could be fixed through behavioral technology, really doesn't need to be. Do you see what I mean? Because the contingencies, the behavioral contingencies, have been sort of taken out of the loop. Mm-hmm. They've been supplanted with engineering technology and legislation. Probably another field in which we began to see the emergence of interesting research but have not continued to see it is in the area of corrections. So, for example, if you go back to the 1970s, you'll find a number of very interesting studies being done in the area of crime deterrence, in the area of working with prisoners to develop more pro-social behaviors and things such as that. However, many of those studies required the use of contingencies that were fairly strong. And there was a movement probably near the late 1970s in which the constitutional and legal rights of prisoners came to the forefront. And as a result of that movement, it became virtually impossible to use constitutionally legal rights in the context of contingencies. So you couldn't restrict access to TV or recreation or various things like that. And much of the work began simply focusing on kind of containment. Mm-hmm. And so there was really not much rehabilitation to be done in that area either.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit. You mentioned kind of two directions here: the profession, sort of, or the field, and why certain areas did or did not flourish. Let's talk a little bit about changes in the field itself, and perhaps speaking to issues of the increasing professionalization of behavior analysis.
Well, I think that hits it right on the head. Behavior analysis has become a profession. When I was a graduate student, there was no behavior analysis as a profession. You were a school psychologist, a clinical psychologist, or what have you. And now you can be a behavior analyst. And I think that's a remarkable testimony to the power of our procedures and the fact that they have been shown to be so helpful in so many different kinds of contexts. So I agree. I think that is the biggest change in the field. And the fact that we now have national certification actually has solidified that change.
Mm-hmm. Is there any sense in which the increasing professionalization of behavior analysis concerns you?
Well, yes and no. I'll start with the no part first. No, in the sense that at the very least, what it does is it raises the behavioral IQ of the culture. You probably remember the old Bear, Wolf, and Risley article, Some Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis. And in the introduction to that article, They said something to the effect, to the extent that a culture will reinforce efforts to improve the behavior of its members, here is a useful technology. And whenever I go over that article with graduate students, I always start with that. And that is the premise that they made. And it was unlikely that that was anywhere near true back in 1968. And it's not clear that it's true of most of the culture today. That is to the extent that we will accept the technology of our behavior. So anything that will sort of increase the behavioralization of the culture, I see as a step forward. And training people to be practitioners clearly will do that. I think perhaps the downside of that is that as we train more and more practitioners, we need to focus more and more on techniques and on specific applications, and to get them out in the world to do good, which means that we're probably not providing them with as good as a grounding as we could in the basic science. And so many people could get certified, can get degrees in applied behavior analysis without ever having, let's say, shaped the rat to engage in any useful behavior. Or they may know little or next to nothing about some fundamental principles of behavior.
Given that, do you have any thoughts about how some of those issues could be addressed as we move forward?
Well, I haven't really thought about that one that much.
Because we're going to continue to see, I think, more and more people become interested in careers in behavior analysis and seeing it as a career track as opposed to a sort of a philosophical approach or a scientific approach to life. And we see, I think, many people making careers in fairly narrow areas in behavior analysis, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about how to maintain the integrity of a behavioristic approach to life as we continue to also press forward in professional areas.
Well, the whole notion of certification began as kind of like a shaping process. Much of the origin of our current certification process was in the state of Florida's certification for behavior analysts, and originally all that was required was a bachelor's degree. Like, you did not need an advanced degree to be certified as a behavior analyst. And so the early certification requirements included both a bachelor's option and a master's option. And even then, with the master's option, the requirements were not that extensive. And so I think that was necessary in order to just get the field going, to ensure some minimal baseline of expertise. I think what will be helpful in the future is if we could begin to shape that certification process to the point where we build into it some requirement that people have some understanding of basic principles of behavior. Now, there is a course requirement such that people who want to be certified need to take some classroom courses in basic principles, but those could be taught in a course in applied behavior analysis, which may or may not touch upon basic principles to a great extent.
Let's shift back again a little bit to your own personal career, and as a former graduate student of yours, I'm a bit reticent to ask this question, but is there anything in your career you do differently?
As in taking different students? Yeah. Actually, no. I almost took a different career path at the very end. When I was getting my PhD, a lot of the clinical work that I had done had been in the area of sort of traditional clinical psychology. And that's where I guess a lot of psychology is being applied, or was being applied and still is being applied. And so I thought it would be really neat to make a contribution in the area of clinical assessment and treatment. And there was an option, there was an MD, PhD option that I almost exercised just as I was about ready to graduate, because I thought, would it not be cool to enter a medical school and to start to introduce sort of the notion of environment as being an equally important determinant with biology, and seeing if that would go somewhere. But being anxious as I was to get out into the world, I decided, no, I'll take a job. And I don't know what would have happened had I gone in that path. But given the path that I did take, I don't know that I'd change anything. I was very fortunate to have been assigned a terrific advisor when I was a graduate student. I was particularly fortunate to get my first teaching job at Western Michigan, which was essentially a high-paid postdoc position, because I was able to sit in on classes taught by people like Jack Michael, Dick Malott, Roger Ulrich, that whole group. When I moved to Baltimore, I'm not sure exactly whether or not I moved there for the best reasons, but in retrospect, it was a terrific move because it put me in an environment where we now had really high-quality medical services, such that we could look more carefully at the problem that we were really interested in looking at, self-injury. And then my move to Florida also was a great move because it put me back in contact with training doctoral students and allowed me to teach in an integrative behavior analysis program. So I don't know that I do anything different.
Yeah. You haven't spoken very much about what is recognized as one of your greatest contributions to the field, and that's the functional analysis itself. How do you see that contribution in the context of the growth of the field over the years, its contribution to that, and the development of the field generally, with your contribution of the development of the functional analysis approach?
Well, I don't know, because so much has been made out of it that I think a little bit has gotten out of hand. I think that at its heart, it's a methodological contribution. It provides one with a set of tools that can be used to discover things. And we didn't develop those tools. We just organized them in a certain way. Those tools were always available for anyone else to use that way. We just happened to use them in a particular way based on our circumstances. And I don't know why they weren't developed before then. I think it was just part of the evolution of the field. That being the case, I think that an experimental approach to behavioral assessment has a great deal of promise because it, like experimental studies in medicine, allow you to identify causes. And it's not so much anything that I contributed or we developed, but rather it's something that we organized and used in a particular way, which seems to have a great deal of generality across lots of different behaviors and populations.
Yeah, you characterize the contribution as largely methodological, but speaking as a person for whom that approach really turned my world sort of on its ear. I was working in developmental disabilities at the time and working with people with behavior disorders, and I attended a workshop presented by you and Gary Pace. And although the methodology that was presented within that workshop was certainly innovative, and what really changed my world was looking at behavior disorders from an operant perspective and recognizing the operant functions of behavior that prior to that point had been absolutely mysterious and unexplainable to me. Can you speak to that level of contribution? Because I think really prior to the 1982 article, not a lot of people, save for maybe Ted Carr, were looking at self-injurious behavior from that perspective.
Well, I think not many people were looking at problem behavior from that perspective. A tremendous amount of work was being done in the area of behavioral acquisition. And the conditions under which behavior would be acquired, maintained, and gotten to occur under a variety of different stimulus conditions. And so a lot of really nice work was being done in the area of behavioral acquisition. That approach didn't seem well suited to behavior reduction, because the problem is not to build something new, but rather to, at least to some extent, get rid of something. And it just seemed that from a clinical standpoint, the thing that was new was to look at a different process. That is the process of reducing behavior from the standpoint of the conditions under which it occurs. And that process was not extremely relevant to acquisition, because behavior that is not acquired doesn't have a history. And so only when we get to be concerned about reducing behavior does history become an issue. And so I think that the clinical contribution was there. I'm not sure how, I'm probably not a good one to answer that.
And I can appreciate that. I think that the influence of which I'm speaking now has been characterized by Bud Mace, I think, as being influential in moving us from a behavior modification approach into a behavior analytic approach. And I think a lot of people in the field see that contribution in that light.
That's probably true.
So you touched on this a little bit, I think, and I think I can anticipate one of your answers to this. What areas of the field would you like to see more fully developed? Would you like to see us pursuing more aggressively?
Well, yeah, one of them I already have mentioned, and that is gerontology. If you look at all the projections, and we've been looking at these projections for years, it's very clear that the senior segment of our population is going to be the most significant segment in terms of incurring healthcare costs very, very soon. It's really funny, but soon after I got my PhD, I ended up running into a former graduate student colleague of mine at a conference. We were just sitting there one night chatting about, well, what's going to happen to the field? And of course, we had no idea. But we just started guessing, and simply based on the census, we said, okay, gerontology has got to be a big area. And that was like 25 years ago, and it still has not come into its own. And so I think it's critical that we begin doing work in that area, because probably within the next 10 years, we're going to be hit with a crisis. It's going to be people like you and me in these old homes having behavior problems. And people are going to have to learn how to deal with us, right? So that's one. Healthcare is another. Behavioral medicine has been a field that was developed, good 20-some years ago. And although there are a number of significant applications to which we can now point, I think that area is still not as developed as it should be. And I guess if I were to just, again, use extent of the problem as the criterion for selecting areas in need of growth, the area of typical clinical disorders seems to me to be one where a behavioral approach has been present, but one where it hasn't had as significant an inroad as I think it should. For example, diagnosis is basically an exercise in DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And so if you exhibit these behaviors, then you're manic depressive. But being manic depressive doesn't explain how you got those behaviors. And so it's sort of in my sort of blue sky thinking about things. I think the real application for a functional analysis methodology would be to go after all these clinical disorders and one by one pick them apart. And say, what is it about a person's environment that contributes to OCD behavior? What is it that makes someone chronically depressed? What is it that makes one suicidal? Is it not enough positive reinforcement or too many aversive stimuli in one's environment? And if we can start to look at traditional clinical disorders that way, then we can organize interventions to perhaps be more effective.
We're not going to be invited to participate in these activities. How do we break into some of these? I think of gerontology as, and I agree with you. It's certainly an area where I think we have something to offer, and it's kind of surprising now, given the baby boomers are now growing old, that we haven't made more of an impact. What do we do to get behavior analysis into these, to bear on these issues?
That's a good question. I used to be impatient about things and jump up and down and scream and say, we need to do this and we need to do that, and this is going to happen, and we ought to be proactive about it. But the longer I've been around, the more I believe that sort of the law of effect rules. Do you see what I mean? And we don't see as much interest in these areas because the problem has not gotten to be staggering enough, right, to force our culture to do something. And so although we all know, not just people of our persuasion, but we as a culture, although we all know that care and treatment of the elderly is going to be a significant problem, it hasn't gotten so bad yet, do you see what I mean, that it overshadows other problems. And I suspect that probably we won't see a lot until it has gotten that bad. Yeah. So if one is forward-looking, one could start to prepare for a career now, right? And a job will be ready for you in maybe about 5 or 10 years. Well, when people finally figure out that the problem is serious enough so that we have to do something about it.
Now, we have made inroads into areas that have not risen to the level of emergency that you're speaking. For example, work in developmental disabilities and in behavior disorders. Is there another door?
But I think that area has benefited from the fact that it grew to be somewhat of a national crisis.
The area of
developmental disabilities. Yeah, back in the 1970s when people were being deinstitutionalized, there was a big human rights movement to get people out of the institutions, and of course when they got them out, well, now they're just living in little institutions, and they don't have any more skills. And everything got to be so costly, we now have to figure out how to deal with that. And I think that's when technologies for behavior change became beneficial and cost-effective.
Yeah. So given all this context and the areas that you'd like to see more work done, what do you think is going to be the future for behavior analysis? You've spoken about some areas where you'd kind of like to see us move. What do you think is really going to happen?
Well, I think that the current professionalization is clearly going to continue. There's no reason to believe that once people learn what behavior analysis is and what it can do, that anything will stop its growth. So that's pretty much a given. In terms of spread of effect, I'd like, again, to think that clinical psychology is one area where you see growth, but it's probably going to be a hard-fought battle because there are so many more people trained as eclectic clinical psychologists who not only are ignorant in behavior analysis, but actually sort of they actively denigrate it. Yeah. So I think maybe another area where there will be growth is in sort of medical health applications, for example, in medical schools. Most of American psychiatry is now moving away from, or it has moved away from, the sort of phenomenological approach, right? Freud is finally dead. And that psychoanalytic influence is now being seen less and less in medical schools, which means that medical schools are going primarily in the area of hard science biology. And as they do that, they're going to have to look for something to account for behavior, right? Because it's not just all cells, it's like environment that influences behavior. And as you begin to look around for scientific approaches that are compatible with the current developments that are being seen in the biological sciences, they're going to have to run across behavior analysis, and they're going to have to love it.
So we have an audience of students in behavior analysis. What message, finally, would you like to send to those students for the future of behavior analysis?
Well, I'd like to be encouraging and optimistic. I think this field is it's a terrific field. I mean, you learn about behavior. What could be more interesting than behavior? And if I were to sort of make any suggestions, it would be to get a good grounding in basic science. Because the application of behavioral principles is based on a lot of work that's gone on before. And understanding how those basic principles operate will only better prepare you in the event that one of your procedures fails. Many people assume they will be effective. When they're ineffective, they don't know what to do. Well, if you assume you're going to fail, then it's really helpful to know why you failed. And that's where you need to be able to rely on fundamental basic principles of behavior. So I suggest that as number one. Number two, in terms of growth, look at the trends in society, look at where problems are likely to occur, and not just that, but the extent to which the solutions will be behavioral technology solutions. I commented on ecology and environment before, and many of the solutions were behavioral, but they were overshadowed by other solutions that were more effective and more economical. But in the realm of human behavior, when hardware technology and legislation are not going to be the solutions, then some other contingencies will have to be used, and that's where you will come into play. The final thing I'd like to, emphasize is, an interest in the empirical side of our field. Students take lots of courses when they get trained. They have lots of practical experience. As a result, they get exposed to a lot of literature. And many people, I think, are under the assumption that what they read in school will be adequate to get them through their career. And I think that it's exactly the opposite that's true. That is, what you read in school simply shows you the importance of knowing what's out there. But more information is available every day. And the only way to keep current in the field is to continue to stay up with the empirical side of our field. Not just in terms of being a consumer, but in terms of being a contributor. There are many people who do applied work. They are in situations that are unique. Not many people like me or Rick will have the opportunity to work with populations that you do. And given your training and the fact that you're responsible for producing some improvement, you're in a good position to do an experiment, to actually show that your procedures were responsible for the improvement, and to empirically demonstrate some cause and effect. And so I'd like to leave you with that.
Well, Brian, on behalf of our group here at the University of North Texas, we want to thank you for your profound contributions to the development of behavior analysis as a field. I'd like to thank you personally for your contributions, very profound contributions to my development as a behavior analyst. And on behalf of the students, we want to say thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today on the development of the field and your career in behavior analysis.
And thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it also.